Okay, so welcome at this third webinar organized by Ireland for a World Beyond War, and thank you very much for participating. I just want to remind everyone there is possible to make a question and also comment in the chat that you can find below. Everyone is on mute, so just the host and co-host can talk in this webinar, but for every question, you can use the chat, and at the end, we collect some question and Dave will answer. And I kindly ask everyone to be respectful and kind while using the chat. And I will now start introducing our host for today is Miriam Ryan. Miriam is a former secondary school teacher and a welfare officer living in Dublin. She is also part of the World Beyond War Irish chapter. And I now leave the floor to Miriam to begin.
Oh, thanks, Eva. The talk this evening then is militarism and the environment losing connection. So this week's conversation will explore how militarism does not just destroy individual lives, but actually is in danger of bringing life itself on the planet to an end. Militarism cuts at the heart of the unique and sacred relationship that we have with the planet, a relationship which sustains and nourishes us and gives us life. So militarism destroys this sacred connection. But what are some of the particular ways that militarism does this? And, how can we ensure that these sacred and life-giving connections are protected and maintained? So I'd like to introduce Dave Donnellan now, who's our speaker for this evening. So Dave Donnellan is an award-winning filmmaker. He lives in Dublin, and prior to becoming a filmmaker, Dave worked in Pakistan for well over 10 years. He worked there as a missionary priest with the Catholic Church, and he's travelled widely, including recent trips to Syria, Palestine, East Timor, Israel. Dave retired recently from Partners in Faith, which is an NGO organisation based in Dublin, where he'd worked for many, many years. So, tough fault you wrote, Dave. You're very, very welcome, and thanks for joining us on this World Beyond War series. And I'd like to introduce Eamon Rafter as well, a Dublin-based educator and campaigner on peace and justice issues. And he'll pick the questions in the chat at the end. So you're very welcome, Eamon, as well. Okay, so Dave, if I might start, really, I suppose militarism disconnects us, from the heart and the unique sacred relationship that we as humans have with the environment. So how destructive is militarism on the environment?
Well, I think there's quite obvious ways in which militarism is very, very destructive. Like, for example, I think I read somewhere recently where the Pentagon in the States, the Department of Defense headquarters in the States, institutionally is the #1 emitter of greenhouse gases on the planet. So that's really an indicator in terms of, it's almost gives us a benchmark in terms of, in dealing with the issue of climate change and environmental destruction, that if it doesn't include the US military in particular, but militarism in general, then it has very little chance of success. So it's sort of a benchmark. And the destruction caused by militarism, I think, is really widespread. One of the situations which has always remained with me from the Iraq War is the situation that the people in Fallujah found themselves after repeated assaults by the US military during the US invasion of Iraq. And in particular, the use of depleted uranium in Fallujah at that time. And I think there was 2 or 3 really serious assaults on the city. And even until today, the number of congenital birth defects, or the babies that are born with congenital birth defects, even up until today, it's about 14 times in excess of what they experienced in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So that's a huge, it's a huge toll on the people of Iraq in general, but in Fallujah in particular. And that example always remains with me, because it's a lifelong, to care for these children, it's a lifelong task, it's a lifelong burden. So that's the type of destruction that militarism, and only one example of it, that militarism wreaks on the environment. And I think we need to hold these people very close to our hearts, really.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned Hiroshima and Nagasaki there, and I know that Salvador Dali, actually, he was so sickened by the obscenity of, you know, bombing two cities like that, that he painted, I think it was John of the Cross, it was called, you know, and that particular painting actually incidentally is in Fastlane in Scotland, and it's beside where the nuclear base is, and I thought that was kind of quite ironic. And Dave, what about then, we say, the Paris Agreement and the Kyoto Agreement? Have they made any difference?
I suppose I'm not an expert now on environmentalism. I just kind of have a personal take on it. I think it's one of the authors I follow quite closely is a lady called Corey Morningstar. She's a Canadian environmental journalist. And she brings a very, very shrewd eye, and she's a very accomplished journalist. And she had a look at the various agreements like Kyoto and the Paris Agreement. And one of the dangers with these agreements is that like the military industrial complex is extremely strong and it's extremely influential. And very often they can utilize crisis situations to their own benefit. And she has been following very closely the influence of the Western industrialists in agreements like Kyoto and Paris. And she gave the example, I read it recently back in, I think it was 2010, COP15, where Evo Morales and a lot of the indigenous peoples in South America tried to put forward a plan of action to deal with the destruction of the environment. And for example, they wanted the threshold set to 1 degree rather than to 2 degrees. And this was the voice of the indigenous peoples of the earth, really speaking. And Evo Morales was very supportive of them. And there was the representative of the non-aligned countries that were pushing this forward, Demamba Diapa, I think his name was. He was a Sudanese man who was negotiating on their behalf. And he gave a very famous press conference afterwards when they were defeated. Their proposal to have a 1 degree threshold set was defeated, and we now have the 2 degrees threshold. And he said it was a very, very sad day, because a lot of the voices of those people who were closest to the earth and whose voice represented the desire to create a relationship with the environment that could be sustained was actually lost. And that the voices of those who were actually utilizing the crisis for profit motives were the ones that succeeded. So I think we need to be very, very careful. And it's always my hope, and my own position would be, I'd place priority on the indigenous peoples, the peoples that are closest to the earth. And they speak from a place of love for the environment and love for the earth. And I think what they have to teach us about how we can live in a way on the earth that's sustainable, I think what they have to say is particularly important.
Yeah. Oh yeah, for sure. I think Einstein had said something as regards the environment, something to the effect of exactly what you're saying, Dave, there. What was it? Something that the more connection that we have with nature, the better we actually understand the world. And I think it's that kind of idea of the people who are closest to nature really, you know, get what's happening in the world. You know, we'll say again, like the agreements, the Paris Agreement, the Kyoto Agreement, that, you know, with the Paris Agreement was the first time that militarism was actually acknowledged as something that damages the environment, you know, which was actually incredible. You know, it wasn't allowed in the Kyoto Agreement to, you know, even mention militarism. you know, so yeah. Okay, again, the whole idea of the indigenous people, I think it's, you know, it seems to be that indigenous people sort of, you know, see the earth, see nature as a kind of, you know, a response, that they have a responsibility. Whereas, you know, the military industrialized complex seems to see it more in terms of, oh, it's their right, you know, and everyone is rights, where they have care of the earth, really. Mm-hmm. Okay, so just moving on then from that question, could I just ask you about Shannon Airport? You protested, Dave, in Shannon Airport. Would you like to tell us about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's been a lot of protests going on in Shannon Airport for a number of years now. I think the first one I was involved in was in 2003 when the Catholic workers went in and they caused, I think it was $2.5 million worth of damage to a plane. And I always remember from that day, from the day of that action, there was a famous headline in the evening newspaper on the day, which said, Catholics invade Shannon. More recently, I was involved about 4.5 years ago with Colin Roddy. And again, we went into Shannon Airport, and at that stage, it was an attempt to have either search some of the US airplanes that were present in Shannon Airport ourselves, or to get the security personnel who were present to search them. And it was Colin Muddy and myself, and both of us went in from a faith angle. It was a faith-based peace protest against the presence of US military at Shannon Airport. And that was, for example, I brought in a cross with me and I brought in a spray can. And while we were making our way from the perimeter fence in Shannon over to the military aircraft, we went along sections of the runway at Shannon Airport, and I actually spray painted crosses at various points along the runway at Shannon Airport. And for me, that was an important symbol, because for me as a Christian, the cross is a symbol of the solidarity of God with those who are suffering violence unjustly in various places like Iraq and Syria and Libya. So yeah, so that was, the action was about 4.5 years ago, and it wound its way through the courts for about 4.5 years. And we finally had our day in court a few months ago. And we both represented ourselves. We didn't need to take the stand, nor did we call any witnesses. And yet a jury of our peers decided that we were not guilty, that we hadn't caused any offense. We had argued that we were both legally and morally bound to do what we did. And the jury agreed with us. So it was a great outcome, not alone for ourselves, but I think for the whole movement in Ireland, and indeed worldwide. Just whenever these things happen, they give people, I think, a shot in the arm. Yeah.
So you feel that that day in court, that justice was done?
I think so, yeah, because particularly because it was a trial before a jury. Like, it was a jury of our peers, and they had known nothing about the case beforehand, and they just listened to all the evidence over a period of 2 weeks. And on the basis of their interpretation or their judgment, then we were not guilty. So I think that was a resounding success. We were really happy with it. So we were, because we hadn't, I mean, the court system can be quite an ordeal. And I think we had managed about 30 court appearances on the way through. So it was a great way to finish it off. Yeah.
And do you think, we just say the very fact that it was drawn out for 4.5 years, as you say, and 30 appearances, is that part of, you know, kind of part of the punishment, we say, or is it part of, is it a natural process in the justice system that it would take 4.5 years and you'd have 30 appearances?
I think it is part of the process in terms of, well, the first thing to say was when I was doing the action, I didn't really spend too much time thinking about the court process. It was really the action in itself that I was focused on. It was only as time went by then it became clear this was going to be very, very long. And I think for the relative seriousness of the alleged offence that we had committed, it was a very, very long time, and it was inordinate, completely out of kilter or out of balance with the actual nature of the alleged offence that we had committed. it was unrealistic. So there was a sense in which it was punishment. The actual process itself was a punishment, even though we were in the end found guilty. But all the time and expense we had to spend over 4.5 years to make sure that we could mount a good defense and to travel to and from courts over 30 times and defend ourselves. It was like a war of attrition to try and wear us down over 4.5 years. But thankfully, in the end, it didn't succeed, and we came out on top. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I think you were in good company over the years. As you say, like quite a lot of others have protested in Shannon. And I'm thinking in terms of, you know, Ken Mayers and Tariq Koff and Kathy Kelly, Margarita Darcy. And Margarita Darcy was actually known as the Guantanamo Granny because when she protested, she was wearing the boiler suit. And I think it was a whole symbol of this orange boiler suit that the people who were taken, some of them through Shannon actually, on these rendition flights, that they were obliged to wear when they were in Guantanamo Bay. And she, you know, she protested on that basis. And I think there was, you know, when actually veterans of peace were in Ireland and they had protested in Shannon, I think they did a peace walk around Ireland. And they were bringing the message of peace and what was happening in Shannon all around Ireland. And I think at one stage they went as far as Donegal. And in Donegal, they were presented with, well, a sapling of an oak tree. And this was very symbolic of sort of, you know, trees are protests or trees are life and trees in nature and the damage that's been done. But it was part of the project, Naming the Children project, because seemingly, according to research, that over 1 million children have been killed in these wars in the Middle East, and these military planes are going through Shannon. And I think at one stage, actually, he was the former UN weapons inspector in Iraq, Scott Ritter, and he actually claimed, or he said, that he saw Shannon Airport, the abuse of Shannon Airport, as part of the US military conveyor belt of death. And I thought that was a fairly strong statement coming from, you know, the UN and an American person. But so just the whole idea of the trees again, I mean, it's something that I was just fascinated by, that this tree was presented, and it was presented seemingly by Sinead Smith. And Sinead Smith is part of this, she's an artist in Donegal, but she's part of this Name the Children project. Because, you know, as I say, at the end of the day, everyone has a name, but these are anonymous. We don't actually even know how many children have died with all these wars. And I think it's Ed Horgan at the moment, down in Clare, who's minding the sapling until it's big enough to be planted in the peace plant, or sorry, the peace camp itself. Yeah. So, would you like to add anything else to that, Dave, about Shannon?
Yeah, no, it's just the trees actually reminded me. I saw a documentary recently that I'd highly recommend called Intelligent Trees. And it was interviews with ecologists and foresters and scientists who were studying pristine forests. And in particular, the life that goes on below the ground of the forest, like in the root system. And they found an incredibly sophisticated network of connections between all the trees, that all the trees were really intimately connected with each other underneath the ground. And they studied this further to find out what was the nature of these connections. And I was really fascinated because I think they were able to radioactively mark compounds like carbon and magnesium, and just to see where all these compounds, what flow was happening underneath. And basically, the picture that emerged was in a forest that they were looking out for each other. All of the trees were looking out for each other. And there was particular relationships. For example, one of the things they found was the older, stronger trees. When they look at the flow of nutrients, they found that the nutrients tend to flow from the older, stronger trees towards younger, weaker saplings. And they call these the mother trees because they looked after the younger ones. And there was a Native American scientist who talked about this, and they said, well, there's a science language to describe that, but also in our own native tongue, she said, we describe the ecosystem within a forest as the forest speaks with one heart. And I found that was very, very moving, actually, that there's an ecosystem within a forest in which it's like a community and in which they all look out for each other. And I found there was an important example from nature of how we're supposed to live together as well. We're supposed to look out for each other because this is the natural way. This is the way nature does it. And I think that's why militarism is such a devastating and destructive and death-dealing entity on the planet, is that it doesn't look out for each other. It tends to bring death and destruction wherever it goes, and it models a way of relating to each other that is not sustainable. It's simply, it can't continue. It has to be dealt with. It has to be confronted and challenged in whatever way we can. And Colin and myself did it in our own small way in our protest. But I think whatever way people can challenge the whole ethos and philosophy of militarism and the military-industrial complex, I think that should definitely be done. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Because that whole idea of trees as well, Wangari Maathai, she was big into trees as well. I think she won the Nobel Peace Prize at one stage, and she was saying something similar, Dave, to what you're saying yourself about, trees show us how to live and the wisdom of trees and all this. But she planted, as a protest, 1 million trees, and she was the one who encouraged the UN to I think they ended up with planting 1 billion trees or something all over the world or something, but it was part of her project, 11 billion trees, I think, worldwide. And she set up the Green Belt movement. So, it's all interconnected, and the environment and, militarism and, what's happening worldwide. We can learn an awful lot from trees. Actually, the whole idea of the interconnection of trees and how valuable nature is, I read something there recently, and it's the very same with fungi. And they have all this communication as well. And they've discovered now with fungi that when fungi are allowed to grow on human waste, that can actually be used to produce leather and to produce building bricks. And it's fascinating. We actually don't even know enough about the environment, about nature, and yet we're prepared to go out and bomb and destroy nature. Actually, and just one last thing on that is, this whole idea of the Galapagos Islands. And the Galapagos Islands, they're a UNESCO protected area. I mean, it's where Darwin discovered all the thing about evolution and everything. Now the US military are hoping to, get more of a foothold there. And I just thought, my goodness, is there nothing sacred in the world, really? So, Dave, were you involved in any other justice movements?
Yeah, just in line with that, there was one other justice movement I was involved in for quite a while. Was in Ireland, in the west of Ireland. There was a Shell to Sea campaign where the Shell oil company had a plan from 2000 to build an oil and gas refinery in an area of the west of Ireland. Most Irish people would be familiar with this, but if there's any people outside of Ireland, they probably wouldn't be familiar with it. But it's one of the most beautiful and unspoiled areas for me now, and I've traveled a bit. It's one of the most beautiful areas in the world, and of course I'm biased being Irish, but I love it. And the local people too were appalled at the decision to build this oil and gas refinery in the middle of this absolutely gorgeous, unspoiled area. So there was a very, very long campaign. And it was successful up to a point in that it delayed the construction of the refinery up to, I think it was 10 or 12 years. But a lot of really very impressive leaders emerged from the community. And one of them was Willie Corduff, who was a local farmer in the area. And I remember talking to him a few times over the period. And I learned a tremendous amount from him because I've grown up in a city and I'm a city boy. And these guys who were at the forefront of the campaign in Shell to Sea against the building of the oil refinery, they were country people, they were rural people. And there was a lot of things that it took me a long time to really understand about where they were coming from. And I was talking to Willie Corduff after the campaign had pretty much come to an end. And he told me once, I always remembered, he said, one of the things I really regret from the protests was all the time that I missed with my animals. And he was really speaking from the heart, and it really struck me very forcefully that there's a really heartfelt connection between the local people there and not alone their animals, but their land. Like in the countryside in Ireland, you'll often be asked, you know, where you're from. Whereas in the city, it's more often you'll be asked, what do you do? Like in the countryside, there's a really strong connection with your place. There's a really strong sense of place in the country. And it took me a long time to really understand that the campaign in Ireland against the oil refinery was really because of the strong sense of place. That people's identity almost emerged from the land. It emerged from the soil. And any sort of attack on the land was an attack on them personally. And that was why they felt so strongly about it. Now, we wouldn't call rural people in Ireland indigenous people. But I think at the same time, they were able to, I certainly learned a lot from that, from those people, about what our relationship with the land should be. Like, it is so, so important. And it's very, very important that where it is attacked and where it is put in danger, that we fight for it. We campaign for it. So that was a campaign in Ireland that I was involved in, and that I learned a lot from, a tremendous amount from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember Dick Spring, actually, at the time, who was the Labour leader, he referred to it as, I think, the great gas giveaway, and that he actually called it economic treason, which it actually was, you know. But and then there's the whole connection, of course, with, you know, Ken Saro-Wiwa. And Ken Saro-Wiwa himself and 8 others were hanged, remember, in the Niger Valley, because they didn't want their land turned into some kind of toxic wasteland, which it was. And it's one of the poorest areas now in the world. But I think in Rossport, they have the 9 little white crosses now to remember him and to, you know, connect that. But I see time is running short. So Dave, I'm dying to get to know, you know, we say about your travels and all that. Would you like to tell us about your travels? Because you've traveled widely.
Well, I was just thinking about this during the week, and like as you said, I spent quite a few years working in Pakistan. When you spend that length of time in a country, I can say I feel like I'm part Pakistani in a really good way, because the culture really has influenced me in really good ways, and I feel very enriched by it. But there was one experience that I had there that I often go back to, because in the second half of my period there, I worked in a place called Rahimir Khan. And every year, we used to travel to Multan, which is about a 2-hour train journey away, to the bishop's house, and just have a meeting and a little bit of a party at Christmas. And I remember one Christmas time I was returning to Rahimir Khan. It was at night, actually, about 11 o'clock at night. I wanted to get back to where I was. I wanted to get back to Rahimir Khan, and I walked down to the train station in Multan. And it was a very cold night. Well, cold in Pakistan is 1 degree, is really, really cold. And it was a very, very clear night. There was no clouds. And I remember when I arrived at Multan train station, I looked up at the sky, and I was just overwhelmed by what I saw, because the sky, the stars were just alive. There was something about them that particular night. There was a majesty, there was a beauty, there was an infinite grandeur about them that I was just, for whatever reason, at that moment in that place, I was just overwhelmed with. I said, you know, I'm so tiny in this. How on earth, you know, am I experiencing this, the full grandeur of the cosmos? And I was so overcome. I suddenly felt very, very grateful for the experience. And remember, I was in Pakistan at the time, so to sort of express the gratitude of being able to experience that, I actually went down like a beggar on the station platform, which is with your head down and your hands up. And I don't know how long I was in that position for, but at some stage anyway, somebody walked by me and put 2 rupees into my hand. As if I was a beggar or something. And when I came to, I saw there's 2 rupees, so that worked. So it was a really wonderful, wonderful experience. But when I was thinking about it since in the ensuing years, I mean, experiences like that are not that uncommon. Like lots of people have those experiences, but usually sometimes they have a sort of spiritual insight with them that can be useful. And I think one of the things that was really helpful to me from that experience was not so much the fact that what I was looking at in the cosmos was infinite and beautiful and incredibly grand and way beyond me, and I was so tiny. What was really overwhelming for me was that I wasn't looking at this from the outside. I was looking at it from somebody who was a part of it. And that was the real significance of it for me, that I'm actually connected with this. You know, it's like the Buddhist insight that all life is one. And I believe that's very true, not just as an intellectual concept, but as a visceral sort of felt reality, that we are part of life. It's not something, when we talk about the environment or nature or the Amazon forests or whatever, we're actually not talking about something that's outside of ourselves. These things are connected to us. The ecologists would talk about habitat, like habitat is what's important. It's the ecosystems, or as the Native Americans would say, it speaks with one heart. Like we're all connected in this. So the fight against militarism is really a fight of the heart. It's a fight of, because we're all connected to this. Every time somebody dies in Iraq or Syria or Libya, part of us dies as well. And that's something that Colin Roddy and myself were very strong on all through the court proceedings, that this was an act of solidarity with all those people who had died in wars of invasion by the US military. These are our brothers and sisters, that for each person that died over there, part of us died as well. And that's why we went into Shannon Airport.
Just want to thank you, Dave, very much. And it has been too short. We'll go to questions now. So thanks once again, Dave.
Thank you, Miriam.
Over to Eamon.
Right, we lots of comments and questions. Thanks to everyone for letting us have your comments. One question I'll come to straight away. I've kind of prioritized questions that connect militarism and environmentalism, Dave. How do we get environmentalists to take peace and militarism seriously? And how also can we ensure that peace activists take the environment seriously? So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think, yeah, there is a learning curve to be got there in terms of the connection between environmentalism and fighting against militarism. I think for me, very simply, it's about relationships. It's about the nature of the relationships that we have with each other and the nature of the relations we have with the planet and even the cosmos. Because if you look at the militaristic philosophy, I think this phrase is often used, full spectrum dominance. So it's not just militarism, it's the economic field, it's the cultural field, that whatever tools they have at their disposal, the objective is full spectrum dominance. So it's about dominance and control and subjugation. So that's a way of relating, to dominate, to subjugate, and to control. And I think it's to understand in a very profound way that is not natural. It's not a human way of going on. It's not the way that we see in nature. Like in the forest, we see that, you know, the trees look out for each other, but that's true of all of nature. That's true of all of life on the planet. There's a very, very finely developed balance of life. So I think connecting in the environment and militarism is about learning how it is that we're supposed to be relating to each other. Yeah.
Thanks, Dave. And maybe just in relation to that, or maybe following on a little bit from that, World Beyond War is working a little bit around issues of divestment from militarism. We know that there's quite divestment from fossil fuels has become, you know, quite a big thing, and some progress is being made. But divestment from militarism has been a little slower. Would you have any thoughts or comments on that?
Yeah, it's not something I've looked at very closely, so I can't say that I have any special degree of expertise in that I could say much. I think one of the one of the areas I think, which it might seem a little bit removed, but I don't think it is, and it's one area that I've been very interested in the last couple of years. It's the whole area of propaganda. Because when we think of the military, we think of soldiers and airplanes and wars. But the military are very, very much engaged with propaganda as well. The example is the obvious example would be Iraq. The weapons of mass destruction. That was a very successful campaign to convince people of the presence of weapons of mass destruction, which we now know was completely false. But that sort of operation, the propaganda operation, it's an intimate part of the activities of the military-industrial complex. And I think in terms of divestment, we need to, I think, first of all, look at the ways in which the military is influential within the mainstream media in getting its message out. Because very often, the ways in which companies are invested in the military is unknown. And the mainstream media tends to, I think, sustain that level of disinformation. Like one of the other campaigns I was involved in over the years has been Julian Assange. And he's been very strong on this as well, about how the military has been very good at controlling our perceptions, the management of perceptions, and that's pretty much propaganda. And they've been very successful at that. So I think a step towards divestment would be to looking at the ways in which the military-industrial complex are able to influence how people think about them. I know that's not directly answering your question, but that's the best I can do, I'm afraid.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And of course, a big question that crops up here in the chat is the big one. I mean, can we really have climate justice without social justice? So, I mean, is social justice, you suggested earlier, I mean, is it very inherent in climate justice, do you think?
Yeah, I suppose I come from a faith perspective, so a lot of the places that I would be coming on that would be from, I suppose the one thing I would say just in response to that would be in the 80s, I was very interested, and 90s, the 80s, 70s and 80s, I was very interested in liberation theology. And they had very specific ideas about what justice meant. And they were very influential with myself. And I think one of the insights that they not sort of discovered, but rediscovered, was that when you're talking about justice, not every perspective is equal. And that was one of the things I learned from the liberation theologians, that in any given situation, if you want to have an accurate appraisal of what the truth of any given situation is, you have to go to the most marginalized, the most disenfranchised, the poorest, the most powerless, the people who are completely on the outside, and listen to them. And that will, not that they have the absolute truth or anything like that, but that's where you start from. And I think in terms of social justice and climate justice, there's a connection there in that it's the same answer to those two questions. If we want to know about social justice, we have to go to people who are disenfranchised and listen to their stories. In terms of climate justice, we have to go to the indigenous peoples who are closest to the earth and who represent the interests of the earth most fully, I think, and they have to be listened to. So I think in both cases, it's about how we relate and who we listen to and whose voices we prioritize. And I think in both cases, it's very specifically the voices that are not being heard. So we have to go search for them.
Yeah, thank you. And just to show that in this webinar, we do have a global audience too. So I have a comment, a question here from a participant who's in Bangladesh. And I thought, yeah, we need to hear that. Why are organizations working against war worldwide? Why are they not united? Because this person suggests that without unity, all our efforts may be in vain.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, it very often depends on what the specific context is that you're talking about, because in different contexts, unity can mean very different things depending on where you are. But I think certainly the unity should start from below. it should start from the people who are most affected by social injustice, or from the people who are most affected by climate injustice. And I think I mentioned before about the I think it was COP15, where they made the decision to decide on 2 degrees as a threshold that we don't want to cross. Whereas with the indigenous peoples and the people from the low-lying islands and Evo Morales in Bolivia, they were trying to promote 1 degree as the threshold, and they lost. And that's going to have serious implications for Africa and the low-lying countries. But so in terms of unity, I think so. I think yes, but it needs to be unity with people who are closest to the problem. And in that case, that was a case where, although the indigenous peoples and the peoples from the low-lying islands and the Bolivians, they were united. And they did come to COP15 with a specific proposals. The difficulty was that's where the unity ended. And they didn't get any support from First World, even environmental organizations from the First World. So I think unity is certainly an issue, but it needs to start from the ground up. And those organizations in particular, I think, need to be listened to.
Maybe we've a chance to get one final question in, so I'll go for it, and if they cut me off, so be it. We know that military personnel and military systems have great skills, but I mean, when we're talking about conversion, could the military personnel be trained to be caregivers, to look after the earth rather than to really combat the environment?
Yeah, I suppose the phrase that comes to mind there would be good luck with that. I think that's a tall order. I must admit, I think the military industrial complex, it's almost irredeemable now. I think it needs to be shut down. I can't see it as a realistic possibility, even if they wanted it, which they clearly don't. Certainly there are individuals, and the Veterans for Peace are a good example of it. I mean, they'd be the ones, I think, who would know, who would be given the most interesting opinion in answer to that question. Like, how do they think it's possible, having their experience within the military? Do they think the military can be converted? I'd say to be a long shot myself.
Yeah. Okay, listen, thanks a lot, Dave. I'm going to hand back now to conclude. Lots of great comments praising your bravery for taking a stand. So great to have you. I'm going to hand back now to finish up.
Thanks very much.
So thanks, Dave. Thanks, Miriam, and also Iman. Dave, you were amazing, and thanks for answering all our questions. Thanks so much for your participation. Also, thanks again, everyone, to their participation. So that's the pool. So we can see that the 8%, so 4 persons say yes, 30, so the 63% say no, and just 29%, so 14 persons say I don't know. So that's the result of the poll today. Before leaving, I just want to remind everyone that you can also register for our 4th webinar that will be held the next Wednesday. You can find it at WorldBeyondWar.org, Ireland. And in the chat, I will now put some link that I put at the beginning, but you can see also now. To get involved and help, you can sign the peace declaration. I put the link now, and also you can let us know if you would like to be part of our group, Irish chapter. Also, if you don't have time for volunteering, you can also support with some donation. I also put the link in the chat. And that's it. You just remind the last things that you can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram. You can find of the name Ireland for A World Beyond War. And I hope to see everyone the next Wednesday. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye. See you next week.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, folks.